Hi, good morning. Hi. Any questions before we continue with our Janusian thinking? Any questions? Okay. So what does this mean? Remember last time we talked about democratic leadership and how it came onto the scene, came on very strongly because the fact was that people weren't happy with authoritarianism, given the history of the 20th century. Kurt Lewin, remember him, ran away from the Nazis, from an authoritarian leadership, said democracy is the alternative. That's going to solve all our problems. But is it? I mean, is it going to solve all our problems in an organization, or is it just about being a pseudo-leader? Wait, let me see. What's going to make me most popular? What's going to make people like me? And then leading according to that. And we know that the most successful leaders are not pseudo-leaders. They're real leaders. And I said last time that while not everyone who goes against the grain is a great leader, every great leader necessarily at some point goes against the grain. Think about it. Why is this necessarily the case? Because if it didn't require going against the grain, if it just meant being a great leader, well, let me just do what's popular, then anyone could be a great leader. So by definition, for greatness, to be unique, to be special, one has to do something that is courageous, that is not done by many other people. That usually means going against the grain. Okay, so where are we now? Throw leadership out the window? Disturbing? Well, no. Over the last 30 years, research in an area called contingency theory has emerged. And what contingency theory shows us is that there isn't one right way of leading. As Ecclesiastes reminds us, for everything there is a season. There is a time to be authoritarian, and there is a time to be democratic. And this is what Janusian thinking is about, right? Looking in opposite directions, synthesizing. To quote John Gardner, the ablest and most effective leaders do not hold to a single style. They may be highly supportive in personal relations when that is needed, yet capable of a quick, authoritative decision when the situation requires it. This is what, if you look at, again, study biographies, and we're going to do a lot of it throughout the semester, all the great leaders do that. They don't have just one style. They're always accommodating, always participating, always asking, what do you think? Yes, sometimes they do that, but at other times, they know how to lay the law. For example, one of the greatest leaders in human history, Nelson Mandela, during the interracial discussions, was very participative. He would sit down, he would listen, he would ask, what do most people think? But then once he made the decisions, he laid down the law very firmly. For example, he said, forget the past. This wasn't a popular decision, by the way, to forget the past. You know what he and Bishop Desmond Tutu pushed for. Many people said, how can we forget the past after what we've been through? After the sacrifices we made, what do you mean forget the past? He wouldn't listen. End of story. That's it. He made a decision. Authoritative decision. But at the same time, also democratic when necessary. You see it in business as well. Anita Roddick, the founder and for many years the CEO of The Body Shop. Extraordinary leader. And the book is unfortunately out of print, but there are some copies in the library here. Highly recommended. Very participative, very nice, very warm person. Democratic, almost to the extreme. But does she know how to lay down the law? When she makes a decision, that's it. She's extremely authoritative. That's why she's been so successful. Look at our most successful military leaders. This is Eisenhower, but every successful military leader. During peacetime, democratic, has time to ask what people think, what they think the best approach would be in a wartime situation. But once war comes, very authoritarian, making decisions on the spot, right there and then. Not soliciting feedback, no time for that. This flexibility, this Januszian thinking, Januszian behavior, is what it takes to be a great leader. Let me move on now to a very controversial aspect of the Januszian thinking. Does a great leader have to be a dogmatist, or can a great leader be a relativist? As I said, this is not just a philosophical question. It doesn't just belong in Emerson Hall, because it has implications. So let me define the two terms first. This is from the Heritage Dictionary. Relativism is a theory, especially in ethics or aesthetics, that conceptions of truth and moral values are not absolute, but are relative to the person or groups holding them. Again, it applies on the, what's called the epistemological level, in terms of what is truth, also on the ethical level, in terms of what is the right thing for me to do. Is there a universal right and wrong? These are serious questions with serious implications. Let's look at the other definition of dogmatism. This is the definition that I got from the same dictionary, American Heritage Dictionary. Defines dogmatism as arrogant, stubborn assertion of opinion or belief. Now, I looked for a less value-laden definition, so I got one from a philosopher by the name of Yoram Hazony. He has an essay called The Jewish State, the Next 50 Years, and this is his definition. Dogmatism is a condition of mind in which essential practical concepts are perceived with such clarity that only one possible interpretation of reality exists. In such a case, all evidence suggesting contrary interpretations, and therefore alternate courses of action, simply disappears from sight, indeed is inconceivable. Two extremes. One, anything goes. No right or wrong, no truth, no universal moral values. And on the other extreme, there's just one way. Universal, it's that way or the highway. This is the split with which we'll have to deal, with which Janus has to deal. Moral relativism is the most prevalent notion and idea that I heard here in the philosophy department as an undergrad, from my teachers, and also from my students. Truth is relative. It's based on a culture. It's based on the place. Most pervasive. Alan Bloom, in his best-selling book, The Closing of the American Mind, says that moral relativism is the greatest problem in our culture today. Why does he think it's such a great problem? Because if everything is right, if everything is equally right, if there is no such thing as truth, then there's no wrong either. Then anything goes. Then why should I even act? Why should I bother about studying things if everything is equally right or wrong? Why should I even bother in terms of putting effort into things if everything is equally right or wrong? So what he's saying is that while relativism comes in order to open our mind, what it essentially does is closes our mind. Now, there are many things in this book I disagree with, but there are certain points that he's making, and again, backing it up with evidence, that are correct. What he says is that almost every student entering the university believes, or says he believes, the truth is relative. If there are problems in the world, well, I don't really need to think about them because, it's not my problem. Who's to say that they're wrong? Who's to say that they're right? It basically closes us off. Now, let me make a statement which I believe is not relative, which I believe is absolute universally. A great leader cannot be a moral relativist. It's a controversial statement. Listen to it. A great leader cannot be a moral relativist. Why? There are advantages and disadvantages to being both. So, if a great leader cannot be a moral relativist, does it mean that he or she should be a dogmatist? Well, obviously, Janice would say no. There are advantages and disadvantages. A relativist, on the one hand, a commitment to open-mindedness and flexibility, critical for a leader, critical for a moral human being. So that's good, the commitment to openness. But on the other hand, it lacks the conviction and certainty for sustained action. Once again, if everything is equally right, it means everything is equally wrong. If there is no truth, if there is no moral or immoral, why should I act? Why should I bother? In order to sustain action, one needs to really believe that something is right. One really needs to believe that something is wrong and to fight against or for it. So the dogmatist, on the other side, certainly possesses conviction and the certainty necessary for sustained action. So that's good. That's important. But on the other hand, lacks the openness and the flexibility. You cannot be a successful leader without being open and without being flexible, especially today in the 21st century. Maybe in the 11th century it was possible. Things weren't changing that fast. Today, when yesterday's news is history, you have to be flexible and ready to change. Tension, again, and Janice loves tension, by the way, between the two extremes. You see, what happened? Why is relativism so dominant today? Think about it. Why is it that most students on campus think that everything is relative, that there is no right and wrong? If you had asked this 40 years ago, it wouldn't be the case. It would have looked very different. But today on campus, most people think it is. Why? There's a reason. Once again, because look at what dogmatism did to us. In the 20th century, with Nazism, very dogmatic philosophy, with communism, a very dogmatic philosophy, throughout history. So many of the greatest crimes in history were committed because of dogmatists who weren't open to other people's ideas and other people's views. Whether it's religious, political dogmatists have wreaked havoc upon society throughout history. So the pendulum was with dogmatism, and then it shifted. And today we have the other extreme, which is relativism. The problem is that the pendulum has shifted too far. That's the argument I'm making. And what Janice wants to do is bring it again to the middle, and we'll resolve it in a minute. So I thought about it. I don't think relativism is healthy for leaders. I think Harvard students are future leaders in this world. So what do I do about it as a scholar? And I thought about a study which I ran here. And a study on purpose went to the extreme. Again, I don't stand behind every sentence the questions that I asked there in the sense of, I don't back them. I would have used different questions, but I used the extreme form on purpose in order to shift the pendulum. And this is a study I ran with Adam Grant, who was my student at the time. Some of you remember him from 1502 last year. He was a guest lecturer here, now a PhD student at Michigan. We ran the following study. Again, taking the notion of moral relativism and wanting to show people, or rather to deconstruct the term. Here is the first question that we asked. Very provocative question. Is any one culture morally superior to any other culture? Now, don't actually answer this, but inside, in your mind, how many would say yes to this question? How many would say no? I can actually tell you how many of you would say yes, because we ran it at Harvard. About 80% of you would say no. Here's the second question that we asked. is a culture that supports gender equality morally superior to a culture that oppresses women? We weren't actually interested in the answer to this question. You'll understand in a minute why. If I ask you this, I also probably know what you would answer. But here was what the study did. This was done on the internet. Group 1 was asked question 1, and as soon as it was asked question 1 disappeared, and question 2 appeared. The second group was first asked question 2. As soon as it answered question 2 disappeared, and question 1 appeared. And the results flipped. So people who were asked question 1 first, 78% said, no one culture is morally superior to another. When we flipped the questions and question 2 was asked first, 79% said yes. Now, again, these questions are not helpful. Again, I took them to the extreme on purpose. I mean, how do you define a culture? What is a culture? It's too big, not nuanced at all. But the point of this study is to show that people don't think about the consequences, the ramifications of moral relativism. It's almost automatic, a knee-jerk reaction. Oh yes, there is no truth. Oh yeah, all values are, cultural specific, they're equal. What this does is get people, think a little bit about it. Think about the consequences, because if you say this, that everything is relative, then the consequences of this may be not doing anything, inaction. And that's dangerous. Leaders have to wake up, have to understand what the consequences are of their thinking. Thought affects action. That's the way it works. And many good people choose to do nothing based on the implicit or explicit belief that, who am I to do anything? That's not enough. Was a highly significant result. Again, if any student wants to replicate something similar to this, I'm always happy to work on it. It's an important question. Now, other than me, who in this room, and be honest now, feels uncomfortable with these results? I don't know, just seriously, does anyone feel uncomfortable with this? I did when I got it. I still do when I teach it. Again, I'm out of my comfort zone teaching this stuff. So, we need help. We really need help. Where is the synthesis here? You see, we all know the dangers of dogmatism. People come and say there's one way or the highway. This is the universal value. Everyone listen here. Very dangerous. I mean, we don't need to go far. All we need to go is, to our very recent history. Not even history. What are conflicts about today? Every single conflict in the world is about, this is my way. I don't even want to listen to you. I'm right and you're wrong, period. End of story, end of discussion. Okay, Nazism, communism, religious atrocities throughout history, committed in the name of dogmatism or because of dogmatism. So we know that that's not healthy. But then what I'm arguing here is that this shift of the pendulum went too far, and there are also dangers to relativism. Because relativism means inaction. Edmund Burke, later quoted by John F. Kennedy, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." And very often, good men and women are people who believe in openness, who believe in flexibility, and that's great. But then because of it, because they've taken it too far to the extreme, they choose to do nothing. And then what happens? A dangerous dance. On the one side, we have the dogmatists, often with evil intentions. acting with conviction, strongly. And on the other side, we have the relativists dancing together and saying, well, who am I to say that they're wrong? Well, there are wrongs. Oppression of women is wrong, whether it's happening in Cambridge, whether it's happening in Tel Aviv, whether it's happening in Riyadh or Rangoon. It doesn't matter. It's wrong, period, universally. Terrorism is wrong, whether it's happening in anywhere in the world. Terrorism defined as the deliberate attack on innocent civilians. A leader has to take a stand, because otherwise what happens? There is a dangerous dance. The dangerous dance is captured by Yeats. Remember the stanza that we read last time, the last part of it. The best lack all convictions, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. The best, very often, the more relativists. Most of us, very good intentions, who want openness, who want dialogue. And that's the important part of it. But then we lose our conviction, because who's to say that we are right? Who's to say that they're wrong? While the worst, very often the dogmatists, are full of passionate intensity. And the more relativists are no match for the other extreme. We need to regain a strong belief in a cause. Now, what cause? That's up to you to decide. Again, certainly no one is going to tell you what cause you should choose. But as I said earlier, a great leader has to have a cause, has to have convictions, has to have strong beliefs. And that also means to believe that there are absolute wrongs, that not everything is relative. All right, so what's the synthesis? The best synthesis that I found was from Parker Palmer, the teacher. This is about teaching the classroom, but it very much applies to leadership. Here is what Parker Palmer says. If we regard truth as something handed down from authorities on high, the classroom will look like a dictatorship. If we regard truth as a fiction determined by personal whim, the classroom will look like anarchy. If we regard truth as emerging from a complex process of mutual inquiry, the classroom will look like a resourceful and interdependent community. Love it. There is truth. Not everything is relative. But it's complex, it's difficult. How do we get there? Through mutual inquiry, through thinking about it. This is what the leader does. When necessary, drawing on people to get ideas, thinking through, processing, digesting, and then coming up with, these are my convictions, this is what I stand for. And then at the same, continuously being open to it. One of the things that we'll talk about when we talk about learning is the notion of success-induced blindness. What's success-induced blindness? It's because you have decided so many times correctly, because you have done so well, as many of us have. We become blind to feedback. We think we know everything already. Success-induced blindness. But when we have the synthesis, we're always open to differing ideas. We're always flexible. We have the best of both worlds, the conviction, the belief, associated with dogmatism, the openness and the flexibility associated with relativism. Not easy, very difficult, but being a leader isn't easy. Okay. So, what does a leader have to be? Tough guy or a nice guy? Demanding or accommodating? Big question in the literature. Let me show you an excerpt now from A Bronx Tale, where C, the boy, De Niro's son, asks his role model, his leader, the leader of the neighborhood, Sonny, what he thinks about this question. There was Gould. Not Sonny, okay. To be feared or to be loved? To be tough or to be nice? Again, not exactly the same, but certainly parallels there. What would Janice say? So we know what Sonny said. What would Janice say about it? Well, I think he would agree with Emerson. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his essay on friendship, says the following, and I quote, "In a friend, I'm not looking for a mush of concessions, a person who will agree with everything that I say. Rather, what I'm looking for is a beautiful enemy. A person who will challenge me, a person who will push me, a person who will help me in my apprenticeship to the truth." What a beautiful phrase, a beautiful enemy. Edmund Burke, similar sentiments. "He that wrestles with us strengthens our nerves and sharpens our skill. Our antagonist is our helper." A beautiful enemy. On the one hand, it's an enemy. It's someone who's tough, who's rough, who's demanding. On the other hand, it's beautiful, soft, nice. Ask yourselves, what kind of friend would you like? A mush of concessions, someone who's just nice to you, who says yes to everything that you do, never challenges you, or someone who's honest and open with you? Almost a rhetorical question. We all want someone who will tell us how wonderful we are no matter what. No. We want someone who will challenge us. Especially in leadership, that's critical. Warren Bennis, "Nothing will sink a leader faster than surrounding him or herself with yes men and women. Even when principled naysayers are wrong, they force leaders to reevaluate their positions and to poke and prod their assumptions for weaknesses. Good ideas are only made stronger by being challenged." This is the number one cause of failure of great leaders. Remember I talked about the success-induced blindness? Leaders believe they're so good after they have succeeded. They already don't listen. They shut down naysayers. They only want people who will massage their egos. Feels great, wonderful. Unhealthy for a leader. Extremely unhealthy. The downfall of most leaders is this. As we'll see in a minute, it's easier said than done to be a leader who truly solicits help and responses. My friends, my family know that I seek beautiful enemies. In fact, after every class, I go to my dear friend and colleague Sean Aker and ask him, "So Sean, what's up? How was it?" And he always tells me. I mean, last time, for example, he told me that he didn't feel enough of myself was in it. He said, "Look, in 1504, positive psychology, you bring who you are. The students really know you. Here, many of the students don't really know who you are. Bring more of yourself into this." So I am. Or my wife, my beautiful, beautiful enemy. After class, she told me, there was some zest was missing. You need more. And you know what we started doing together? We started watching more videos. The Bronx Tale, for instance. We watched it last night, and I put this part in. Again, to bring more extra things into the class. We finally found a great stand-up comedian that we'll institute throughout these lectures. I asked the TFs for video clips, funny video clips or cartoons or something, so that I can add something extra to the class. Because my beautiful, beautiful enemy told me that there was some zest missing, and I agreed with her. It's critical to have beautiful enemies. The best organizations in the world have it. Lou Gessner, initially of McKinsey, later CEO of IBM. McKinsey had a culture that fostered rigorous debate over the right answer, without that debate resulting in personal criticism. We'll talk a lot about how do you give feedback. Just this morning we were talking in the TF meeting, so Jan was making the distinction between feedback and criticism. Criticism is about just me criticizing someone and just wanting to get something off my chest. Whereas feedback is about me giving someone something that they can use. Or the words that we'll use in this class, rather than feedback, words that Marshall Goldsmith, who's an executive coach, uses, is feed forward. Rather than feedback, feed forward. Why? Because we are giving people ideas of, here is how you can improve so that you can move forward even better. That's critical to create an environment, and it will be critical in your groups to do that. How do you give good feed forward to people? How do you solicit good feed forward from others so that you can improve as a leader, as a person? Ron Heifetz, the real heroism of leadership involves having the courage to face reality and helping the people around you to face reality. Jack Welch from General Electric had a mantra, make it real. It has to be real. Good news, bad news, I don't care. Make it real. Easier said than done. I don't think there is one person in the room here who wouldn't agree with the fact that we need beautiful enemies, both on the personal level and organizational level. The question is, though, how many people really are beautiful enemies to others and solicit or are truly open to beautiful enemies? So challenging and being challenged. Not many, research tells us. Chris Argyris, a professor emeritus at the business school and the ed school, joint appointment, did research where he distinguished between in-use theory and espoused theory. And here is what he wrote. Espoused theories of action are those that people report as a basis for actions. This is what people say. This is how we behave. Theories in use are the theories of action inferred from how people actually behave. This is what they actually do. And what he found was that there was a disconnect. They were not always the same. So on the one hand, they would say, yeah, I want to be a beautiful enemy. Yeah, I need beautiful enemies. But on the other hand, they don't behave that way in practice. You know why? Because he continues. Most individuals studied seem to be able to detect the discrepancies between their espoused theories and theories in use of others, but were not able to detect similar discrepancies in themselves. We're blind. Success-induced blindness, well, it's another form of blindness. We're blinded by what we do. Too close. We can't see it. So even though I say, yes, I want to be a beautiful enemy, I believe in it, I am a beautiful enemy, actually I'm not. In many cases, it's not always the case. Or if I say I really want to get feedback and to be challenged, in practice, I push away, consciously or subconsciously, people who come and challenge me. I know for me, soliciting feedback from others, looking for beautiful enemies, is something that I really worked on. Those of you who have taken or will take 1504 know in my work on perfectionism, I was extremely defensive, couldn't hear negative criticism, always wanted to hear the good news, massage the ego. But I've worked on it, and I've become much more open to beautiful enemies. But then I have a problem on the other side. Even though I know how important it is that I'm a beautiful enemy, I'm not that great at it. I don't want to hurt people's feelings. I haven't really mastered, the beauty part of the beautiful enemy. And it's a challenge. This is one of the things that I'm working on this semester. I told you, we are taking this class. I'm working on becoming more of a beautiful enemy, being more challenging to others, because if I want to develop as a leader, as a teacher, I have to learn how to be that for others, not just expect others to be that for me. So this is one of my personal goals. Again, each one of you in your groups, in your sections, will come up with things that you want to work on, whatever you want to work on. It could be your public speaking skills, because it relates to leadership. It could be your interpersonal skills, because it relates to leadership. It could be your organizational skills, whatever you want to work on. It could be working on procrastination, because that's important for leadership, i.e. not procrastinate. No. There are many leaders who procrastinate. Whatever you want to work on, you can work on. There is a real challenge to challenging. It's not easy. Again, in theory, we all say it's important, but in practice, very few of us are really beautiful enemies. Harry Truman, it takes one kind of courage to face a duelist, but it's nothing like the courage it takes to tell a friend no. He said this of his personal hero, Jackson, who could tell a friend no, who could be a beautiful enemy to other people. There's also a story that Nancy Reagan tells in her memoir, where when her husband was the president, the vice president, George Bush Sr., came to her and said, Nancy, you have to go talk to your husband about the White House chief of staff. They were having problems with him. To which she said, well, why don't you go and talk to him? He said, no, it's not my role to talk to him about this. And she responded, this is exactly your role. And she was exactly right. A president doesn't need yaysayers. A president needs beautiful enemies. A president or a teacher or a department head or whomever. But it's not easy. There's a story about Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was the Communist Party leader in the 1950s. And Nikita Khrushchev came to visit the US as a gesture of goodwill. The Communist Party leader comes to visit the US. And after his visit with the president, he took questions at the Washington Press Club, DC. And he took written questions. And this was the first question. Mr. Khrushchev, today you talked about the hideous rule of your predecessor, Stalin. You were one of his closest aides and colleagues during those years. What were you doing all that time? You were one of his closest aides and colleagues during those years. What were you doing all that time? Khrushchev's face started to turn red. He looked around and he said, Who asked this? Who asked this? His veins started to come out. Who asked this? Complete silence. That's what I was doing. That's what I was doing. This was not communist Russia, this was in Washington. There was no threat of a gulag. And yet when he asked the person to identify him or herself, when there is a leader standing on stage, complete silence. That was an important lesson for these journalists there. Can you imagine what kind of fear he experienced when there was the threat of a gulag, when Stalin had executed millions of people? Where were you during those years? Where are you now? It's not easy standing up and challenging. It wasn't easy for Rosa Parks to sit down where she sat down. But that's what makes a leader. Daniel Goleman talks about the CEO disease, the information vacuum around a leader created when people withhold important and usually unpleasant information. What he shows, and again, there are studies, to be precise, by 2002, there were 177 studies showing this, that the higher you get on the hierarchy in an organization, the less reliable feedback you get. In other words, if this is seniority, this is years of seniority, and this is reliable feedback. This is what the graph looks like. More of a leader you become, the less you hear. Do you realize why it's so important for leaders to create an environment that solicits feedback? Because mostly you won't hear it. And by the way, it applies not just for leaders in multi-million-dollar corporations. It applies to leaders on campus as well. Just as it's not easy to challenge others, it's also not easy to be challenged. Most of us would say, yes, we want to be challenged, we want to hear feedback. But as my friend and colleague, professor at Toronto says, Mike Moldovano, we say we want the truth. What we mean is that we want to be correct. In theory, we say we want the truth. In practice, the way we behave is that we want to be correct. John Kenneth Galbraith, our own, faced with a choice between changing one's mind and proving that there is no need to do so, almost everybody gets busy on the proof. Again, some truth to that too. You see, very often we rationalize ideas rather than look for the rational response. And a leader cannot afford to rationalize. Yes, he or she may succeed in the short term doing it, but not in the long term. The truth has to be above being correct. So to summarize, the leader needs a circle of associates who are willing to be both supportive and critical. Pity the leader caught between unloving critics and uncritical lovers. Leaders need reassurance, but just as important, they need advisors who tell them the truth, gently but candidly. I want to end with an anecdote about Harvard, about something that I saw here about 5 years ago. Now, I don't know if this anecdote is relevant, if you can generalize from it. You know, one would need to run a study on it, and if anyone wants to run a study, I'm happy to support it. But this is an anecdote at a university where our seal is about the truth, veritas. I was involved in an organization that were the two leaders. One of them came from Harvard, the other came from Boston University. And what this organization did, without disclosing its name, was basically help at-risk population. About halfway through the year, the leaders of the organization went to the two groups, to the Harvard group and to the BU group, and asked them, we want about feedback. They said, how about we go and get some feedback from the students, the people you're working with? The Boston University students immediately said, when can we start? We want feedback. The Harvard students said, that's not a good idea, we don't think it's necessary. You know, we are volunteering, you know, it's temporary. They asked the same question, well, how about feedback from your peers, people who are in the program with you? Boston University students immediately said yes. Harvard students, it's not a good idea, you know, why bother, and, you know, it's only a temporary program. Now, as I said, I don't know if this can generalize or not, but if I had to make sense of it, one of the problems that we face as Harvard students or Harvard alums is that we've done well to get here. We've succeeded very often. And maybe we haven't failed enough. In 1504, I talk about the idea of learn to fail or fail to learn. It's a critical aspect of leadership. We're going to spend a whole week talking about crucibles, about overcoming difficulties, about the way to becoming a greater leader through hardship, by hearing negative feedback at times. It's not easy being a leader. You know, I've said it a few times already, and I'll say it many times throughout the semester. One of the things that we need to in order to become a leader is to be open to criticism. And we cannot afford to give up opportunities like these students had the opportunity. Well, Here's the good news and the bad news. In this class, you're going to have a lot of opportunities to be a beautiful enemy and to be challenged by beautiful enemies. You're going to get a lot of feed forward, and you're going to give a lot of feed forward. In a safe environment, this is why the beautiful part is necessary. To summarize, the healthy synthesis is of the person and the situation. It is not enough for a leader just to think that it's all about the person. Has to take into consideration the situation. At the same time, the passivity, 1 minute, I'm almost done. The passivity that comes from just thinking that it's all the situation is also unhealthy for leadership. A leader needs to know to be both democratic and authoritarian. It depends, contingency theory. Synthesizing between the apprenticeship to the truth, but at the same time being open and flexible. Both are necessary. And finally, being a beautiful enemy is about being tough and challenging and demanding and honest, but at the same time also being accepting, being nurturing, being nice. I've communicated some, I think, controversial ideas, especially in this lecture. If you have any questions, disagreement, I always welcome challenges. I always welcome beautiful enemies. See you on Wednesday.